Hey, Dr. Amber here. Today's episode is part of a 10-part series for my virtual book tour. Yes, I am going on tour virtually, and I'm having 10 amazing conversations with people that I know and I really admire around the topics of overwhelm, overstimulation, dysregulation, all in preparation for my new book, A Parent's Guide to Self-Regulation, a practical framework for breaking the cycles of dysregulation and mastering emotions for parents and children. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This conversation I really enjoyed, and I think you'll get a lot out of it too. And also, don't forget to order your copy of the book. You can get it on Amazon, Target, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, literally wherever you buy books. Okay? Enjoy the episode, and we'll talk soon. People know. I'll introduce myself a little bit, then I would love for you to introduce yourself. So before we get started, of course, I'm Dr. Amber, clinical psychologist and author of A Parent's Guide to Self-Regulation. The book is really for parents who have found themselves struggling to help their children learn self-regulation, emotional regulation, because you yourself are challenged or really struggling with maintaining your own self-regulation or your own emotional regulation. So the book really helps parents with that, and I'm so excited for that. But Dr. Earl, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. So Dr. Earl Turner, I am the founder and executive director of Therapy for Black Kids. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist and author of the forthcoming book, Raising Resilient Black Kids, which will be coming out in October, I think. So stay tuned for
I
some
cannot wait to hear
information
about
about
that one.
that.
That sounds like a powerful combo right there. Both of those. Well,
Yes.
I was thinking about how to actually open up this topic, and I felt like we should just drop the question: can a dysregulated parent support a dysregulated child? And I would love for us to just talk about that, but I was just really curious what you thought. Do you think that's possible? Can a dysregulated parent support a dysregulated child?
So I'm sitting with that idea a little bit because I want to say that if a parent is not regulated themselves, that they might be able to, but then on the other side, I understand from my work as a child and family psychologist and working with families that when parents struggle sometimes to manage their own emotions and feelings, it makes it very difficult for them to help their child to self-regulate as well. So I think that it might be possible, but I think it also creates some additional challenges for a parent who is dysregulated to also help a child who is dysregulated as well, because I feel like it's going to be like this
Yes,
cycle of
I
dysregulation.
agree completely. And also anyone who's watching and listening today, feel free to ask questions. Feel free to add your own insights. I'll be looking at the comments and we can definitely comment on any comments or questions you have. But I would say I think I have to agree with you. I also was kind of sitting with this question today because I knew we'd be talking about it. And I just wondered, okay, what does that actually look like? What happens when there is a parent who is dysregulated, but then they also have a child who too is dysregulated? How supportive is that parent able to be, or how much capacity might they have to really help a child to regulate themselves if they are not regulated? And I just really became very doubtful of whether this was possible, and or if it is possible, there's probably a lot of limits and restrictions, especially in their
Yeah,
capacity to really be there and support their child.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I talk a lot about with parents, particularly for parents who have a child who is exhibiting some type of disruptive behavior, which is one of the areas of my sort of specialty, is that if your child is having problems behaviorally and you're getting upset at them for sort of having these issues, whether it's at home or in public, then that's going to make it more difficult for you to like figure out, okay, what is the most effective? And I use the air quote here with like managing that, because if your emotions are cycling, you're yelling, that's probably not going to be the best atmosphere to sort of help that child to soothe themselves
Exactly.
or to calm down.
Exactly. I completely agree with you. And it's so funny when you said that I had this image in mind of maybe a parent. I don't know why this image specifically, but I just saw this parent shopping at the grocery store with their child, and for whatever reason the child gets upset and emotions are heightened because then the parent gets upset, and plus there's also this, now they're in public, and so there's this like spotlight effect and they're feeling even more anxious. And I just was like, okay, this child, let's say maybe there are some behavioral concerns or some emotional concerns, or maybe it's just a child who wants gum and mom or dad said no. You never know. How
Yeah.
how in what way is that parent able to support the child if they themselves are really struggling with that moment? And I just know that that happens so often. It could be at home, it could be something at school, it could be something at the playground, but I know that parents really struggle with that. And I don't know about you and your practice, but I've also noticed that sometimes parents don't realize when they themselves are dysregulated. It can be months
Mm,
or years that they're in this state and they just have no idea. Mm-hmm.
yeah. Yeah, I think that that's sort of a question that, as I was thinking about the book and our conversation today, was what are the signs of a dysregulated parent or even a dysregulated child? And obviously, I think from my own like clinical experiences, there are some disorders or problems that may make it more likely that someone is going to experience some type of dysregulation. Particularly, I think, again, with kids like a child that has ADHD, they're going to have problems, regulating themselves, problems with impulse control. And so I was like, well, what are the signs, for that a parent for a parent to like recognize, like, hey, maybe I'm also having problems with sort of
Yeah,
dysregulation. So
that's
I don't know if
actually a
you
great.
can maybe answer
I'm
that.
glad you said that because I feel like we often hear about what dysregulation looks like for kids. I think there's many of us online who are speaking to that. I know you do a really great job of that, helping people to understand what emotional concerns or disorders may look like for children, or what it looks like when a child is anxious or depressed or dysregulated. But we don't hear the same for parents. And so in the book,
Yeah.
one of the first things I did, and actually the first chapter, was I talked about how dysregulation is not something that only happens to kids. There's this misconception that, hey, if you're struggling with maintaining your emotions, if you're struggling with regulating yourself emotionally or cognitively, physiologically, something's wrong with you. And that's also something that's only for kids. It's kind of like, well, that's childish, or you need to grow up. You're a parent now. You're not supposed to. That's absolutely
Mm,
not true. And in fact, adults and especially parents become dysregulated often. And I think sometimes we don't notice it because, one, there's shame around if we're not feeling okay, especially as a parent, but then also there's just not enough conversation about it. So, what might it look like if a parent is dysregulated? I think it can look really similar. There might be instances where that parent may experience a lot of anxiety. They may really have trouble managing their emotions. So it might be they may get really irritable very quickly, or they may notice that there are certain things that their child does and it makes them very, or sometimes feeling really
yeah.
angry. Whenever there is a parent who lets me know that they are frequently overwhelmed, that also could be an indication, hey, maybe there's something going on with how we're regulating ourselves and we need some skills or some work around that. But then also, if you're feeling overstimulated a lot, I feel like the word overstimulation is a buzzword we hear a lot online now, but it's a real thing. And so overstimulation
Mm,
every now and then can happen, but if it's something that's happening every single day, especially when you're parenting or around your kids, that could be a sign that you're over or dysregulated. But also, if in general you're struggling with your mental health, or if you feel like you can't keep up, or if you feel like you're just not content, you're not happy, if you feel like you're burnt out, those could also be signs that you're having trouble regulating yourself. So I think that it's something that should be normalized, not stigmatized, not shamed. If
yeah.
you're just generally not feeling grounded, not feeling well emotionally, feeling like you're thinking a lot or your brain is pacing, there's a lot going on in your head. All of this could be an indication that you're dysregulated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that sort of comes up for me, particularly um, around like having conversations with kids about racism, which I sort of alluded to with my book that's coming out, is I think for some parents it can be really difficult to have that conversation with your child about instances of witnessing sort of racial violence when you haven't sort of gotten or dealt with your own emotions around the topic. So it's going to make it that much more difficult for you to like talk with your kids about that topic if you don't know like how to soothe yourself. And even for me as a psychologist, like I know when I give a workshop or presentation around this, I still get like physically um, overwhelmed sometimes by the topic, and I can feel it in my body. And so I have to learn to like regulate my breathing, for example, in that moment, so that I can still sort of get through that type of conversation. So I think for parents to sort of recognize, like in a lot of different situations, the ways that you cope with your own sort of emotions and thoughts can also impact how you help your child to sort of regulate, you know, some of those situations too. So it really is important that you understand like what are your sort of needs when it comes to like regulating your body and being able to cope with different types of experiences or stressors that you're going to be dealing with, and how those stresses are going to impact your parenting and how you help your child to
Yes,
regulate as well.
everything you said was so spot on. I love that you brought up the topic of racism or oppression. And, I know many of my clients are Black or African American. I work with Black children a lot, and I know that you do as well. But whether it's racism or some other stressor or trauma that you're experiencing, it is challenging when you yourself experience it as an adult, but then also even more so when you're having to work your child through something like that, or child through something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about experiences of racism or injustice or oppression, that can feel so emotionally charged. Even me just talking about that, I feel this visceral reaction that I'm having. So imagine how challenging it is to then support a young person through that. It's so hard. And it reminds me, there's another portion in the book where I talk about, I call it parenting triggers. What are those things that
Mm-hmm.
come up for you in parenting that does elicit this emotional response from you or does heighten your senses a bit and can make it challenging for you to feel grounded in the moment, or maybe you need to utilize some extra coping skills? For some people, that very well could be those conversations about race and racism and, scary things happening. For other people, it could be something else. But absolutely, that was spot on, that comment that you made.
Good. Well, I'm really excited. I think, you know, one of the things that I appreciated about the book was obviously like you talked about the differences between like dysregulation versus regulation, you know, and those pieces, but also just the different ways that dysregulation sort of can show up. And you sort of briefly touched on that a little bit as well. But I think just sort of recognizing too, as a parent, that there are many ways that you could be dysregulated. And I think one of the things that sometimes comes up for me when working with either, you know, parents or even just adult clients is the ways that we cope sometimes are masking our inability to regulate ourselves. And so I think people who may have unhealthy coping practices, for example, like that is one way that you are, I don't say mismanaging, but you're ineffectively coping with that situation instead of regulating it in a sort of more healthy way. So as opposed to, you know, taking a moment to sort of breathe, um, you might decide I'm gonna go smoke, I'm gonna go drink because that helps me feel good in that moment. And yes, that's part of like regulating your body is to remove this discomfort that you may be feeling and sort of to soothe yourself. And it may work short term, but it's not something that's sort of sustainable. And obviously, like there are other long term consequences, to using substances as a way to sort of cope. But I think that's also something that's really important for parents to recognize is that, do you have your sort of toolkit to sort of cope and soothe yourself in different
I
moments?
completely agree. And what I'll say to that is, again, I think sometimes as adults and then parents, we don't realize what behaviors or patterns we've picked up, all because we really needed comfort or we really needed some sort of stress relief or stress management. And sometimes those could be healthy habits like, oh, well, I walk when I'm stressed out because it makes me feel better. That's wonderful. Or versus maybe the comment or the other example you gave of, well, every time I'm stressed, I do this or I do that. These things that maybe are not so healthy. And so, one thing that I also really talk about in this book is really identifying what are the ways that you're comforting yourself or you're coping with stressors, or what are your stress management tools. You might find that many of them that you have are just maladaptive and they no longer work the way they used to, maybe because now you're a parent or because there's children around. Or you might find that there really are none at all that you can identify, and that means, well, we got to fill you up with something. We got to build your toolbox so that you can find these ways to cope and or replace some of the more negative means of coping to have healthier, or replace the ones
Yeah.
that are just no longer working. But I want to pause quickly because I do want to acknowledge everyone here and just let everyone know, hello, if you are just joining us, we are talking about the topic or answering the question, can a dysregulated parent support a dysregulated child? And this is all in support of my new book, A Parent's Guide to Self-Regulation, which will be released June 18th. If you have not pre-ordered your copy, you can definitely do that on my website. The link is in my bio, or you can actually purchase it on Amazon, Target, Walmart, Barnes and Noble. It's everywhere. I think I was reading a comment. It looks like Routine and Things said that she pre-ordered her copy and she's excited. So I'm so glad you pre-ordered your copy. I hope all of you do so as well, especially if this conversation resonates with you. So Dr. O, I think absolutely. I love the topic around how are parents coping and what are the tools they need. I love this conversation. And actually, I wanted to ask you a question too, because I know that you've done a lot of work supporting parents and children. And this is also another question I think that could be related to this. And we both can talk about this. What do you think is the best way for a parent to help teach a child self-regulation tools or self-regulation strategies? I don't know if that question has come up for you in your work with parents, but what do you think?
Yeah. I think for
Mm-hmm.
me, a big piece of it is obviously you having your own healthy ways to cope with stressors. And along those same lines, I think for me, one of the things that I talk a lot about with parents in terms of helping kids to regulate themselves is the importance of modeling for the child ways to sort of cope. So I think um, sort of on a more direct way, you can sort of meet with the child, play a game, sit with them, whatever activity that you want to do, to be able to teach them these self-regulation, practices, or just sort of recognizing that kids are watching you as parents or even as adults. And so I think that's for me, sometimes a bigger piece of the conversation that I have with parents, because I think sometimes it's like, well, I told them to, if they get upset, count to 10, or go for a walk, or whatever. But then when you get upset because, somebody ran in front of you, and I use this example because I have, a little bit of road rage. Traffic bothers me a lot. So somebody cuts you off in traffic, and then you're like, you explode. And so that's not, you didn't use your coping skills. So now you want them to like use their coping skills when they get upset. So I
Yeah.
think a really big piece of it is, making sure that practice what you preach. And I try to do that myself. None of us are perfect, but I think, being able to sort of show your child that, hey, if something goes wrong, things don't go as planned or scheduled, this is how I sort of say, okay, you know what? This is not the day that I planned. And it's not to say that you can't still be upset about that moment, but also like, do you teach them and model for them like, okay, yes, I'm upset, but you know what? I'm gonna take a minute. do some breathing, I'm gonna calm down, and we're gonna get back on track and figure this out. So I think those are some really important pieces to help teach kids how to regulate themselves, modeling for them how to do that, and obviously, I think practicing with them, which is something that, as a big focus of my work is oftentimes pretty behavioral. And so, practicing those skills, with the child to say, okay, this is what you need to do in these situations.
I'm so glad I asked you that because in my head I was like, he's just gonna say the same thing I've said, and you got it, modeling. I really gonna say the same thing. So I was like, let me just let Dr. Earl answer this one because I know we're gonna be on the same page about that. And actually, Precious K. Williams in the chat, she said something that I think is so important. Kids do what they see more than what they say, which is so important.
Absolutely.
And it's so funny. It actually reminded me of back when I was working with parents a lot more closely in therapy. Sometimes I would have parents come in and, really have a lot of concerns about some behaviors that their children were doing. And then next thing you know, I'm working with the parent on how to manage those with themselves. And they're like, wait, but I'm not here for therapy. My child is, and I have to explain. But the best way to really teach this is for me to make sure that you also can do this as well. And so, sometimes that concept sounds so simple that it's like too simple. And it's like, well, no, there must be more. There's something else I need to be teaching my child. There's something else I need to be saying to them, or there's some worksheet or something they could be doing or something. No, and it really is, especially for the parents who are struggling themselves with dysregulation. I find that those parents can feel really overwhelmed by the idea of I have to also teach my child, but I help them see the best way to teach your child is for you to learn this yourself, for you to learn what your triggers are yourself, for you to learn how to regulate yourself. Because when you get to do it in the moment, your child is watching, they get to learn from you. And then as you master these things, then you can teach. But your first method of teaching will be modeling. And so I really like to help parents understand that one because it's the easiest way to go, but then also if you're struggling yourself, you get to just practice it, and that's really good because guess what, kids will give you so many opportunities to practice your self-regulation skills because trust me, they will. So I'm so glad that we're on the same page about that. Modeling is absolutely the best way. And so if you are a dysregulated parent, guess what? You actually, I don't know, maybe now I'm wondering, does this turn the answer around? If you're a dysregulated parent, you can start to support your child now by you yourself learning self-regulation tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. The other piece that I think, sort of going back to your example that you talked about, like being in the grocery store or something like that, I think the environment sometimes also impacts how parents might be more or less dysregulated. So I think, one thing that I was thinking about in preparation for this was like, for really young kids, they are pretty often, or it's common that kids are going to have some type of tantrum behavior at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Some kids worse than others, but part of it I think sometimes is parents don't know, like, when their child is having a temper tantrum, especially when it's in public. What do I do to sort of manage this particular behavior? And some parents I've seen, they've, I don't say mastered, they've used the strategy where they just decide, like, I'm gonna just walk away, and they can stay there if they want to, but I'm gonna go to the car. And most kids, they'll get up and they'll run because they don't want to be left, by their parents. But I think that's sort of an example of how, when kids are going to be dysregulated, you have some choices that you have to make. And sometimes because of people watching or other things, it can also make you feel like, okay, now I don't know what to do in this situation because normally I might do this, but now everybody's staring at me in the store. So now what I sort of do. So I don't know if you have any sort of
That's
suggestions
a
for
really
that.
good one because I'm just thinking about what if you're in an environment that you maybe don't feel fully welcomed in, or maybe you feel judged by others about your parenting approach, or maybe you're perceiving the other people around you to have some sort of negative bias or perception of you. That would kind of throw you off a bit in terms of what you would typically do, or you might start to behave in a way that's just not typical for you because you're being influenced by whatever you think other people are thinking, or fears you're having, or the shame that you anticipate you might feel, or the judgment or the embarrassment. So, you know, this one is a tough one because I think that's a reality. That's the facts of the matter. When you're out in public, or if you're maybe with other family members and you fear that you may be judged, you may react differently. But I think that's why it's so important to get really intentional about how you want to shift your parenting with regard to how you're regulating yourself. Because I think sometimes what can be helpful in that moment is to remind yourself of the bigger why or the bigger picture. In the book, I spend a lot of time talking about that piece because sometimes in the moment when you're so dysregulated, if you're so frustrated, you're so overwhelmed, it's hard to really remember the why when maybe you're dealing with the tantrum or you yourself are so upset. But in the book, I spend a lot of time helping the reader get to the core of what do you actually want out of this parenting experience? What do you actually want for your child? Why do you want to be a parent? What do you feel like your child really needs? And sometimes that just doing that reflection can get you to the core of the matter and give you some strength, some courage, some armor to really combat any of the other fears or the hesitations or the anxieties you're feeling in that other moment. I also think support can help with that, right? It won't take away the experience necessarily, but if you have a community around this topic, or if you have a therapist or a friend that you can go to talk about this experience, I think that can also help too because it'll give you that validation that you might need to say, hey, yes, I know that was hard. Yes, there probably are some people judging you for not doing this or that in that moment with your child, but guess what? I see you. I know what you're trying to do, and you're doing a really good job. I really wanted the reader of this book to feel supported throughout the entire book. And that's why I share so much of my personal experience in the book and also here online. You all know I talk about this professionally, but as a parent personally, this has been challenging for me too. And so, I want the readers to know you are absolutely not alone when you experience these things. And you're also doing such an amazing job because just you ordering the book, just you being on this live to have or engage in this type of conversation is really an indication that you want to be different. You want to work on yourself and you want a different experience for your child. And I commend any parent who does that. So feeling supported, feeling like you have a community, but also really getting to the core of why do I want to do this hard work of regulating myself or learning about my emotional capacity, modeling these behaviors for my kids. So even in the hard time, I can remember why I'm doing it and it'll help guide me in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think that's a really good point that you mentioned about getting that support. And so I think, as a non-parent of many kids through my practice, I think I always let parents that I'm working with know that yes, I'm not a parent, so I understand like things might be a little bit different, but just given my sort of experience and training, I also want to support you and also recognize that you're not going to get it perfect all the time, and that's okay. I say this a lot. When you have a kid, they don't come with a manual, so most parents figure it out, along the way, and I'm the first of three, and so I know like my mom probably didn't make, the best decisions along the way. But I think you sort of learn sort of what works for your child. And so I think that's a really big, important piece to sort of recognize like, yes, I might know how to regulate myself, and that might be helpful for me in certain moments. But then there may be some times where those specific things are not going to work necessarily for my child just because of their temperament and their individual. So really thinking about those pieces as well. I think sort of what you touched on about that sort of support piece is really helpful. So that way, let's say you've tried something that maybe has been effective for one of your other kids that's not for this one child, then I think that can also be helpful to get that advice from others to say, hey, these may be some other things that you can try, or this you've done the best that you could, and
Absolutely,
I commend you for that.
absolutely. And I know that we're coming close to our time. The 30 minutes went very fast. So I
Yes.
it sounds like a perfect piece to end on that part of none of none of us will do this perfectly. This process that, I like to think of parenting as this lifelong journey that you only get perfect at when it's at the end, right? Like it's not this thing where, oh, I'm going to read this book and now I'm going to be perfect. Yeah, you're going to read the book and you're going to feel more confident. You're going to have more tools and skills than you started with, but this journey continues. And in my hope that A Parent's Guide to Self-Regulation, the book will really help guide you on the journey and keep you focused and motivated to continue the hard work. But none of us are perfect. We will not do this perfectly. I think many of us are also kind of coming around to that idea that our parents probably didn't do it perfectly, and that's okay because there is no manual for any of our kids, and we all really are doing the very best that we can. So, Dr. Will, any last comments, any last thoughts? I loved this conversation today, but anything else that you're thinking about with this topic?
I think it was a great conversation too. So thank you for inviting me to engage with your audience and to also share this, with Therapy for Black Kids community. I think it's a great resource. I think, one of the things that you just sort of touched on that I think also you expanded upon in the book was how parenting today is different than maybe our parents' experiences. And I think parents have a lot of different challenges, especially with technology and how that impacts the lives of kids now. So I think that in itself is a sort of topic on its own to talk about how do you help kids regulate the uses of technology and staying away from social media. So I think it's a great resource, and I'm excited for you in this book and excited to share
Yes,
with
thank you
the
so much.
community here.
I too am also so excited. I'm gonna let you write that next book about helping kids regulate themselves because I know if I'm ready, I feel like you could do that. I think you would nail that. But again, I completely agree with you though, and I recently had a podcast episode about that. So if anyone who wants to check in about uh, the podcast episode just talking about how parenting is just really shifted. That's actually this week's podcast episode, Dr. Amber's Know and Grow podcast, for anyone who wants to tune into that or join that conversation. Parenting looks different and feels different than it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that's why, again, it's so important for us to be having these conversations, for us to be learning new tools and new strategies because everything is shifting and we really want to be ahead of the game so we can be the best parents for our children. But Dr. Earl, I so appreciate you for being here. Where can people find you and connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, thank you for having me. Congrats on the book. You can connect here at Therapy for Black Kids. You can also find us on Facebook. You can also connect with me on my personal page at Dr. Earl Turner, which the link is in the bio on the Therapy for Black Kids page. And so all of my
Wonderful.
socials are Dr. Earl Turner.
And for anyone who, again, you have joined us, we just finished our conversation answering the question, can a dysregulated parent support a dysregulated child? I think we got to a really good answer, but if you missed it, definitely go back. I will be saving this here on IG, but I'll also be posting it on YouTube, and then the podcast next week will be there too for anyone who wants to listen to it that way as well. If you have not pre-ordered your copy of the book, please do so, A Parent's Guide to Self-Regulation. Pre-order it today and it will be at your house June 18th so that you can begin reading it, learning so much more about this topic. Shoot me a DM, you all, if you did decide to pre-order your copy. Let me know what you're most excited about, or go to the comments on this live and let people know what resonated with you in this conversation, and then also if you've pre-ordered your copy. Well, thank you all so much. Book tour 2 stop, or virtual tour stop, is on Monday, and on Monday I'll be talking with Jasmine Chanel, and that topic will be about beating overwhelm while building your business, which I think is also another important topic if you are someone who is an entrepreneur wanting to build a business or maintain your business, but you're finding yourself really overwhelmed. I think you'll enjoy Monday's discussion. Either way, thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Earl, and I will talk to everybody.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Take care.